It is day 177 of the second Trump administration, and tonight, new inflation numbers are confirming what many economists have predicted. That
looking at things, whether it's made in Canada, as long as it's not made in the States.
For explicitly political reasons, I have been...
President Donald Trump's fury exploded onto the world stage when news broke that Canada had effectively rejected over 150,000 tons of US beef. The ripple effects of this decision poured into Europe and Asia as Canada inked massive new meat export deals. Last week's headline wasn't just a trade story. It was a story of geopolitics, national identity, market realignment, and one man's explosive response to a neighbor's quiet pivot. Trump went ballistic on his Truth Social platform, branding Canada as the ungrateful partner, calling out Ottawa for abandoning American ranchers and slapping a crisis on US agriculture. Sources tracking beef shipments confirmed that refrigerated containers full of US beef were either delayed for weeks or outright rejected at Canadian ports. That singular disruption laid bare the fragility of supply chains that have carried cattle and beef across the US-Canada border as if it didn't exist. Picture over 150,000 tons of US beef halted mid-shipment, trucks idle at border crossings, ranchers and meat packers grappling with immediate losses, American Midwestern farmers racing to find new buyers or forced to sell cattle at fire sale prices. Meanwhile, in Ottawa, Canadian officials quietly executed a pivot, redirecting demand toward domestic meat and multi-billion-dollar contracts with the European Union and Asian markets. As exports slammed shut to the US, doors opened wide across global markets. On the ground in Canadian beef country, ranchers celebrated renewed demand. Meadow grazing filled with cattle. Packing plants ramped up processing. Export contracts soared. The domestic sector saw profits rise as export confidence surged. Meanwhile, in America's Farm Belt, age economists warned of a cascade: cattle herds shrinking, pre-slaughter inventories collapsing, US beef prices rising due to constrained supply. One major feedlot in Alberta stopped restocking its cattle, citing uncertainty over tariffs and trade. They weren't alone. At the heart of the crisis lay Trump's sweeping reciprocal tariffs policy, triggered in early February. Implemented under IEEPA, it imposed baseline tariffs of 10% on nearly all imports, with country-specific rates, 25% for Canada and Mexico, taking effect March 4th, excluding energy at 10%. In response, Canada retaliated with matching 25% tariffs on key US goods within days. When Trump followed up in February with 25% steel and aluminum tariffs, the escalation touched off global tremors.
We don't need anything, so why are we losing $200 billion a year and more to protect Canada? And I said that to, as I called him, Governor Trudeau. I said, listen.
But that's only half of the story. Canada went beyond tit for tat. Ottawa seized on a private member bill, Bill C-202, which became law June 26, 2025, to shield its supply-managed industries, dairy, poultry, eggs, from future trade deals. That legal move sent a signal. Canada would no longer allow trade negotiators to compromise these sectors. With that law on the books, Canada could refuse US agricultural exports without violating any trade treaties. They had created a legal firewall. That firewall allowed Canada to take even more dramatic turns, directing meat exports toward EU and Asian markets under freshly negotiated deals. Yesterday's headlines reported that Canadian beef had landed billion-dollar contracts in Europe and Asia, while US beef shipments stood rejected. Behind the scenes, Chinese and Japanese importers rushed to meet escalating demand, empowered by Canada's clean supply chain and stable regulatory environment. Global beef buyers responded quickly, cushioning Canadian ranchers even as American exporters teetered. As this international realignment unfolded, the US domestic ranching sector reeled. Reuters reported that America and Canada both faced shrinking cattle herds. Canadian ranchers were deliberately reducing herds amid tariff uncertainty, driving up US beef prices. The timing could not have been more devastating. Trump's policies not only threatened US market access to Canada, they disrupted domestic herd rebuilding just as prices were climbing. Trump's reaction was nothing short of explosive. He demanded Canada pay for what he called a betrayal, threatening to escalate tariffs on Canadian dairy, lumber, and even beef. He claimed Canada had exploited loopholes in trade law around supply management to shield its markets unfairly. In a signature Trump rhetorical flourish, he called Canada our artificial border buddy and threatened additional import taxes if passageways weren't reopened. Meanwhile, Canada responded with unusual restraint.
Because we owe $36 trillion too. We're going to start knocking it out pretty.
They didn't announce a beef embargo. They didn't slap new tariffs or announce subsidies. They simply culled imports through procurement rules and quietly redirected supply. The result? US containers laden with meat returned empty or full for weeks on end. No overt trade war headline, just sustained disruption. It was what one analyst called a quiet decoupling of continental cattle. The effect sharpened as US states faced rising beef prices. Ground beef up over 43% since 2020, hitting low-income consumers hardest. Grocery store shelves saw tighter supplies. Food service businesses struggled to keep burgers and steaks in stock. US ranchers facing rising feed costs and limited herd size struggled to rebuild. The ripple went digital too, with Trump taking to social media to rally his base, accusing Canada of a coordinated political attack timed ahead of the 2025 US midterms. Across global markets, European and Asian meat importers seized the opportunity. Canadian beef carried a clean production narrative, supply management credibility, and access under EU-Canada Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement and CPTPP regimes. With Bill C-202 backing Ottawa's policy, Canadian beef became a preferred option for regulators focused on climate and sustainability. Reports suggest that Canadian negotiators secured oversight on carbon intensity that US rivals could not match. That global shift poses deeper questions. If Europe and Asia can tap into Canada's supply chain anchored beef, why would they continue to rely on US sources that lack the same legal and regulatory assurances? Canada suddenly emerged as a climate-aligned supplier, and it leveraged that image aggressively. US exporters found themselves not just blocked, but outmarketed on values, a realignment of global demand channels. Back home, Washington and Congress split over the crisis. Republican domestic farm lobbyists pressed Trump to ease up, warning the cattle sector faced structural damage.
They send us a lot of other things that we don't need. We don't need their cars, and we don't need the other products. We don't need.
Meanwhile, McConnell and Senate Republicans called for a bilateral dialogue with Canada under USMCA frameworks. Democrats pushed for legal challenges at the WTO, but Canada's actions, backed by domestic law and trade rules, limited any legal remedy. The US was stuck politically, with no clean path to retaliate without provoking bigger blowback from EU partners. Trump, however, doubled down. He proceeded in July to expand tariffs to include 30% on EU and Mexico starting August 1st. That broad escalation, combined with retaliatory potential in dairy and beef, threatened to splinter long-standing trade alliances. Canada, meanwhile, continued negotiating deals indifferent to the kinetic elements of Trump's trade strategy. In Canada, Prime Minister Mark Carney emphasized sovereignty, saying Canada is not for sale, and branded US tactics as destabilizing and unfair. Ottawa's messaging framed the beef move as reclaiming national capacity, redirecting supply to sectors aligned with domestic and global climate goals, rather than jettisoning a key trade avenue. Canada made no fanfare. They let the deals speak for themselves. Now, the question is simple. Did Canada merely deflect US aggression, or did it launch an industrial repositioning that may permanently tilt North American beef trade? With supply management codified, new EU-Asia contracts secured, and US access restricted by both law and practice, Canada may not only have bounced back, they may have leapfrogged. On the US side, ranchers worry they'll never get their lost market share back.
Their cars, and we don't need the other products. We don't need their milk. We got a lot of milk. We got a lot of everything. And we don't need any of it. So I said to him, well, why are we doing it? He said, I don't really know. He was unable to answer the question, but I can answer it. We're doing it because of habit, and we're doing it because we like our neighbors, and we've been good neighbors. But we can't do it forever, and it's a tremendous amount of money. And why should we have a $200 billion?
Rebuilding herds takes years. Regaining regulatory trust among buyers takes even longer. And if Trump's tariffs persist or deepen, that pathway may close entirely. So what does all this mean for the global beef supply chain heading into late 2025 and beyond? Will Trump's aggressive tariff strategy produce a sustainable shield for US industry? Or will it exact a price far higher than he ever intended? Can Canada sustain its pivot without inviting its own retaliatory risks from other trading partners? And what role will the WTO or USMCA arbitration play if US lawmakers finally seek legal recourse? One thing is clear. When more than 150,000 tons of US beef was turned back at the border, it signaled something far bigger than a simple trade spat. It revealed the extent to which Canada was prepared to defend its domestic agriculture, to shift global markets in its favor, and to reclaim agency in what had been a one-way North American relationship. And Trump's explosive reaction, ridicule of Canada, threats of expanded tariffs, media alarms over food prices, only underscored how high the stakes have become. This isn't just about beef. It's a touchstone in a much larger ideological battleground over trade, sovereignty, climate policy, and the role of government in global supply chains. A convergence point of economic diplomacy, legislative sovereignty, and presidential brinkmanship. As this story continues to unfold, hit like if it helped you make sense of Trump's beef meltdown and Canada's market pivot. Leave a comment below with your take. Is this a smart defensive play by Canada or a long-shot gamble that may backfire? And make sure you subscribe for our next deep dive into how these trade disputes could shape elections, farming communities, and food prices heading into 2026.